Thank you, Rod, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to share my work with this group and have a conversation with you about running randomized controlled trials. And in particular, I'm going to talk about one type of randomized controlled trial that my team and I have been very excited to pioneer over the last several years. So I'm going to talk about whether or not this form of randomized controlled trial, megastudies, can improve the impact of applied behavioral science and management research. As you can see, this is joint work with a very large team of collaborators, and I am not going to name everyone despite the fact that they all made invaluable contributions. I will just highlight that Angela Duckworth has been my key partner in crime on everything you'll see, and also we have an amazing group of staff at the Behavior Change for Good initiative at the Wharton School who make this work possible and contribute in many ways. Okay, so let me dive in and sort of motivate what I'm going to talk about by describing a phenomenon that has really shaped my field. I consider myself a behavioral scientist, a judgment and decision-making scholar. There's been a giant shift over the last really 15 years where policymakers have become much more excited about getting advice, not only from traditional economists about how to organize government and change human behavior for the better, whether it's encouraging tax payment, reducing crime, increasing vaccinations, sort of you name it. There's been excitement not only to reach out to traditional policy voices like economists, but also to behavioral scientists. And this has been in part because of a book published by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler in 2008 called Nudge, which introduced the idea that there's a lot of insights from behavioral science that can be applied at low cost to pressing policy problems. So this has spurred the rise of actually units embedded in government and many also in organizations, I should say. So it's not just when I talk about policymakers, I'm not only talking about governments, so that's a large audience that I care about, but also inside organizations ranging from Google to Morgan Stanley to Humana or Blue Cross Blue Shield. Lots of groups have started focusing on offering policy advice based on behavioral science. And just to show you the global reach of behavioral science teams in government, and again, this is also happening in companies, but in government, we went from, in 2008, there were no units that focused on behavioral science, lots of policy units focused on economics, but not on behavioral science, to last count I heard was we're approaching 500 around the world in obviously not just countries, because we don't have 500 countries that I know of, but in cities as well. Many cities have local units that have the function of offering applied behavioral science insights to improve outcomes for citizens. Okay, so with this explosion of interest in behavioral science comes a conundrum. Those of us who are doing research that we hope will inform policy, whether it's, again, policy being made at the government level or inside of organizations, we would ideally be offering advice that's based on the gold standard. And the gold standard is randomized controlled trials in a field setting. So not a laboratory experiment or a survey study or an intuition or a theory, but empirical evidence showing this theory I have bears fruit when applied to this policy problem in the wild, in the real world. So, okay, that's the gold standard, great. But that's a little bit challenging for a number of reasons. So first reason is just doing a single field experiment to test your theory in the wild is slow and it's complicated and it's expensive. So often we don't have a field experiment at all when we are asked a question by a policymaker like, how can I reduce turnover in my organization? I don't know, maybe there's literally never been a field experiment run to test my best idea. And now I have to go test one, it's going to be complicated. Okay, another challenge is sometimes we're lucky and we are in a situation where the question a policymaker asks us does have some evidence, right? Someone has run a field experiment or we have run a field experiment and maybe even we've run a couple and we have a couple of ideas of things that might work. I'll give you the context of retirement savings. That's a setting where there has been a lot of research done in the field looking at different tools we can use to encourage employees to save more for retirement. So we know, for instance, that offering a match, so every dollar you save, your employer puts $1 in too. That increases the attractiveness of saving to employees. We also know that if you default people into a savings plan, meaning they're automatically enrolled, but they can opt out, that increases contributions. So that's a situation where we have field experiments, We have multiple field experiments, but here's the challenge. We might want to make a comparison and say which of those two approaches, matching or automatic enrollment, is more cost effective. Which one should I roll out in my setting? And here we run into a problem, even when we've got that gold standard evidence, which is the studies that have been run to answer the question, prove this works in the field, are usually run on wildly different populations. So the best matching study, I believe, comes from a project done in Denmark. The best evidence on defaults comes from military personnel in the US, really different populations. So we can't really compare the effect sizes and say like, well, this is the better policy. We have apples to oranges comparisons we're stuck making. So that's tricky. And then finally, a big challenge in all of applied behavioral science that I'm sure that you are attuned to is that we've been experiencing a replication crisis really over the last 15 years. And I shouldn't say over the last 15 years, it's more that we've become aware of it over the last 15 years. I think there was always a challenge that the work being done was not always done to the highest standards and would not always replicate, and we didn't always have robust findings. And with the with the revelation that that is the case, that not all of our insights are robust and have been done properly, and there's a file drawer problem, then we also have to worry when we're offering advice, are we sure that this study was done in a way that will replicate? And so that's another challenge. Okay, so what's the solution? I'm going to propose a solution to all of these challenges. P.S. I don't think this is the only solution, it's a solution. It can be part of a solution, but I think it's really exciting. I'm going to talk about the value of megastudies. And let me also say, I'm going to share data from 3 megastudies that we've done so you see what I'm talking about. So the idea of a megastudy is that rather than conducting a traditional field experiment or a randomized controlled trial in a policy relevant setting with an organization or a government, you could actually test multiple ideas simultaneously instead of just one at a time. And so basically a megastudy is a very large field experiment with many smaller sub-experiments embedded in it, synchronously run with the same dependent variable. So if Ebrod has a hypothesis about what might, say, increase retirement savings, and I have a hypothesis and we think both of these are great ideas, but we have no idea which one is best, or even if our great ideas are valid in the first place, instead of each of us going and collecting data separately in separate samples, we design the studies that we want to run, and then we pool them and launch them together. And now we have a whole bunch of good things that happen if we do our work that way. One of the benefits is now we have total comparability. We can make apples to apples comparisons between the benefits of what Ebrod's idea led him to test and the benefits of what my idea led me to test, right? He was interested in matching, I was interested in auto enrollment. We run them together and we see, oh, you know, Ebrod's idea is better. Matching is more cost effective than automatic enrollment. So we have this comparability, which is really beautiful. Another big asset of this is that the fixed costs of executing a massive field study are very large, and now they can be borne by a single central organizer, creating lower marginal costs for individual scientists of testing their ideas. So we're creating a shared resource, a playground, if you will, that lowers the cost of entry for additional folks by having that fixed cost borne centrally. We also reduce the risk that's inherent in any study of maybe my hypothesis is invalid, or maybe I'm not going to learn much because it could be an implementation challenge. So I can't just say, often when we get a null result, we can't distinguish between, does that mean my hypothesis is false, or like, did I just implement it poorly? And so you might do all this work, run a field experiment to test a single hypothesis, and end up at the end of the day unable to say much other than, well, it's not a silver bullet, but I don't really know what went wrong. If you test a dozen ideas at once, the likelihood that every single one is a flop and you end up with sort of no policy recommendation you can offer is much lower. Of course, we have to think about multiple comparison, correction, and so on. But even with that, you're reducing risk by having a portfolio instead of a single chance on goal. You can also run megastudies as tournaments. and encourage interdisciplinary teams to participate, which I think is really exciting. In our field, there's a lot of silos and a lot of groups of people who are asking similar or related questions, but they don't have an incentive to collaborate or pay a lot of attention to each other's work because they want to publish in different journals. So to be a little more precise or clear, imagine Ibrat prefers to publish in economics journals and thinks economics is that's where he wants to be, and I want to publish in psychology journals. We wouldn't have much incentive to cross-pollinate our ideas because each of us wants to publish separately. But if we are part of the same mega study, we can each design our own sub-study and plan to publish our results in our own preferred journal. I brought it in the econ journal, in a psych journal, or management journal, or whatever. But then we'll see the results of each other's studies, and we'll ultimately have our findings combined into one sort of manuscript that goes to a general audience journal and just shows here are all the results together. We'd write our own theory, our own introductions, sort of combine our own other data with our sub-study, but there is going to be some cross-pollination as a result of being in a mega study together. Another thing that I'm very bullish about, but I also want to say this hasn't led to exciting results yet, and I hope it will in the future, is the idea of tailoring. So if you, or phenotyping to use sort of the medical term, we often talk about the importance of personalization, the fact that different individuals might respond differently to different kinds of interventions. Maybe, for instance, matching contributions in a 401k is really attractive, or in a retirement savings account would be really attractive to young men, but maybe automatic enrollment is better for older women, or maybe it depends on where you are, what region of the world, or your background. So normally when we do a study, we just sort of say like, here's my main result and here's the subgroups who benefited most. If you run a mega study, you can actually start to say, oh, here's 12 different ways of increasing retirement saving we tested. Not only here's the best on average, but there's different winners in different subpopulations, and we might offer a tailored policy recommendation, like you want to roll this out for this group and this out for this group. So tailoring becomes more feasible in this kind of work. And finally, it should accelerate the pace of scientific discovery relative to our usual one-at-a-time study process, which, especially if you have a pressing, burning policy need, might be very important. And I'm going to talk about the example of how do we encourage vaccination as a great problem for applying mega studies. Okay, let me just do some, nod where nods are due. This is not an idea that came out of nowhere, right? There's a lot of past work that suggests this is a good idea and could be useful. In particular, I think we owe a huge debt of gratitude to sort of looking to a similar idea that revolutionized artificial intelligence research about 15 years ago, which was that artificial intelligence researchers working on a problem used to sort of each have their own pet data set that they work in and present their own results and have their own criteria of saying like, oh, my image recognition algorithm is great. I tested it on this data set and it worked really well. And someone realized we need to have like a common playground where we test in order to accelerate knowledge. And basically researchers started competing to solve the same problem, say image recognition, with the exact same data set. So they all work with the same, say, set of faces. They'd use the same validation method. They were subject to the same constraints, so the same criteria of success. And this really improved outcomes because now different algorithms could be directly compared in terms of their efficacy. And we could say like, this is the best performer, in the same data set, subject to the same constraints. It really helped the field to converge on this common task framework. And what we're suggesting is something very similar. Of course, there have always been toy problems that people like to play with in our field, like think about the prisoner's dilemma game or ultimatum games. There's a common task there too, but not a common pool of participants. And of course, we know Caltech undergrads, when they are in an experiment, behave really differently than undergrads in Tunisia or undergrads at University of Pennsylvania. So even though we would have maybe some toy problems that we work on that have a common task, what we're adding is another layer, which is the randomization, means that the same people at the same time frame are also exposed to common interventions. Finally, I just say teams competing to solve a problem, but often, in fact, I've never heard of those involving random assignment. So that's a distinction here, but the tournament is of course a motivation for this as well. Okay, so let me get into some data, which I know is what we all find most exciting. I want to tell you about 3 model mega studies so you can really sink your teeth into what does it look like in practice, how well does it perform, does it actually yield new insights. So the first project we did that I'll talk about, and these, I think all the papers I'm going to present briefly today, I believe were circulated to this group in advance. So you have access to these if you want to dive into any of them. This was published late last year in Nature. And it was done with 24-Hour Fitness, a large US gym chain that has many locations and many members. And the goal was to encourage members to exercise more regularly. So we put that out as the challenge. We're going to try to increase exercise, and we invited scientists to increase exercise among these gym members. What we did is we invited collaborators on our team to design different studies, and 30 different scientists participated. They designed 20 different pre-registered research studies with a total of 53 different experimental treatments. So what this basically means, right, is that there's 20 separate studies that would normally be an island, and each published as its own paper if it yielded interesting results. But those studies all have multiple treatment conditions, right? So they have a treatment, a control, maybe a second treatment arm, and that's how we end up with 53 different experimental conditions launched in this mega study. And then we also had a placebo control condition, and that group basically got an empty treatment. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. All of the researchers who were doing the study could vary several things. They were basically given a sandbox to play in. So what we told them is we're going to build a 28-day digital program to try to encourage exercise among 24-Hour Fitness members. So 24-Hour Fitness members will sign up, and then they'll, on a website, basically a web app, they'll see different information that you, the experimenter, can vary. You can vary everything from whether they answer survey questions, what screens they see, whether they see videos. You can also vary whether they get any incentives. So they might get paid for going to the gym, for instance, or paid for responding to text messages they receive, or paid for how they answer a survey question. And then you can send them reminders to exercise. And actually most of the versions of the program, maybe almost all of them, part of the sign up survey was that they created a schedule. They told us the dates and times when they wanted to exercise. So you could then send reminders 30 minutes beforehand, and you could tailor what that reminder would say. And you could also, as a researcher, send interactive text messages, so two-way texts, up to 3 times a week, as well as once weekly emails. And again, you control all the content and all of this if you were one of the scientists, and you get to design what you want it to say to try to increase exercise. Okay, so a placebo control condition is the key baseline against what we're going to compare all of these programs that were designed to encourage exercise. What happened in that baseline placebo control is that people who were members of 24-Hour Fitness signed up, and then they were told, congratulations, you've signed up for this program. Here's a small incentive payment that you're going to receive, which, by the way, we'd created to be roughly equal to what we thought people would earn on average in other groups to hold gift exchange constant. And then we said, good luck. And that was it. That's the whole program in the placebo group. So we're going to compare how these other things perform relative to that empty shell of a program. We also had a tougher challenge for scientists to beat, which is that we built a program that was sort of based on best practices, as far as we knew at that point, on encouraging exercise. So this program invited everyone to make a plan, the dates and times when they wanted to exercise, sent them reminders 30 minutes before each of those planned workouts for the next 28 days, and offered them what we call micro incentives, about 21 cents per gym visit. And that was delivered in the form of points that were convertible at the end of the program for an Amazon gift card. Okay, and then scientists designed, like I said, 53 other treatments to test all sorts of hypotheses. I am not going to tell you about all the different things they designed because we don't have time, and I never would go into that much detail. Lots of them are dogs that didn't bark. This just gives you a sampling or sort of a sense that it was everything from economists testing different kinds of incentive schemes to psychologists thinking about reframing exercise and the kinds of activities you should be doing to focus on enjoyment versus effectiveness. It was a really wide range, and I'm going to highlight some of the big winners in a moment. Okay, so just to give you a little more sense of what this all looked like, we built this app that looked like a professional workout program, essentially, and people could sign up when they agreed to the terms and conditions. They were consenting to be in a research project. They then told us their first and last name, their email address, their phone number, and we texted to make sure that that was a valid phone number. And if it was, that's when they were randomly assigned to different experimental conditions. So randomization happens at that point to the 54 different experimental conditions. For everyone who wasn't in a placebo control, they got a first screen that looked something like this, where they're welcomed, told they'd earn some points for registering. They learn that there are these points they can accumulate and are told how to earn them, and that they can turn them in and cash out at the end of the program. Most people got a screen where they made a plan for the dates and times when they would exercise. They got a lot of extra content depending on their experimental condition at that point. So maybe they saw videos or got other instructions, and then they're told they're all set. Congratulations, the program's going to start now. And for the next 28 days, you can expect to receive, reminders and some customized texts from us and incentives, as well as weekly emails. So that's the experiment. That's the sort of in a nutshell. And just so you can see the reinforcement that happens over the next 28 days, they're getting these reminder messages. Some of the treatments involved some reinforcement of whatever the core hypothesis is seeking to test. This is an example from a study that was trying to encourage people to look for fun ways to work out as opposed to effective ways. Those were the two ideas tested against each other. And so this is just a reinforcement. Hey, did you do something you really enjoyed when you last went to the gym? If people said yes, they're told great. If they said no, they were reminded, don't forget to do things you like. And then they also receive reinforcement of whatever the hypothesis tested was via email. Okay, this is my first results graph, and it's a lot of information in one place. So let me try to orient you to what you should focus on. I do not want you to read everything on the y-axis. Your head will spin. Instead, I'm trying to show you sort of a distributional result. So that's what this is. So, okay, the x-axis is showing a regression estimated increase in weekly gym visits induced by a given treatment condition we tested. So what's the size of that extra number of weekly gym visits, right? So, and the 0 point is our placebo control condition. So the blue dots correspond to an estimated treatment effect. Each one is a different treatment condition. And that gray line is sort of our 0 line to say compared to baseline or compared to the empty placebo. So, and then we've got 95% confidence intervals plotted around those estimated treatment effects. So what you can see visually is that all these little blue dots are to the right of the gray line, except for one, or maybe 2 or 3, depending on how you define to the right. So what that means is that basically every program developed and tested was directionally better than signing people up for a program that didn't have any content. So that's great. I think that's really exciting news. And then the question is like, how many are statistically significantly better? That's what we care about as scientists. But directional is nice too. Statistically speaking, 45% of the treatments significantly outperformed the placebo control. Now, this is without any corrections for multiple hypothesis testing. We can talk about that in a bit, but you'd expect 2.5% in a two-tailed t-test to outperform significantly, and 45% do. So you don't need to be a statistician to know that means this will survive statistical correction, right? This is not a fluke. This isn't noise. Behavioral scientists were able to create programs that increased exercise significantly. So that's exciting. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is that we had built a sort of best practices program that everybody had to compete against, which had planning, reminders, and micro incentives embedded. And it was much harder to beat that. So the performance of that is the dotted line. About a little more than half, about 2/3 of the programs outperformed that. It isn't noise. Again, 9% outperformed significantly. 2.5% would by random chance. We can run an F-test and say, we are doing better on average than this condition, but it's a lot tougher, and there are many fewer programs that are real standouts against that. So I think that's interesting to learn as well. And I'm going to highlight a few of the big winners that I think show the most interesting and promising things worthy of follow-up research. So the top performing treatment, I think, is a really interesting one. It involved offering people a bonus to return to the gym after a workout. And it was a tiny, so this is not really about monetary incentives. I think that's important to keep in mind. This is about drawing attention to the idea that you don't want to miss multiple planned workouts in a row. So people are normally paid 21 cents for every gym visit they make. This particular treatment added a little bonus, a whole 9 extra cents, right? Not enough to cover the gas to drive to the gym. So it's more about focusing, I think, than the cash itself. If you come back the day after a missed workout. So imagine you said, I'm going to work out Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Then you miss your Wednesday workout. You know that if you come back on Friday, you're going to get slightly more points than you would on a typical day. So it may be an extra reason psychologically to recognize, I don't want to miss 2 scheduled workouts in a row. Let me get back on the wagon. So this turned out to be really effective, trying to keep people from having a sequence of misses, just one, and then we get them back. Increased gym visits by 27% relative to our placebo control, and that's quite statistically significant and also better than our sort of best practices program. I should also say all of these things are designed to be incredibly cheap. The average cost of these programs was 75 cents to implement for a month, and that was also by design because while exercise is very important, it is also important that we made these programs cost effective so that they would make sense to roll out in the population. The second top performer is pretty boring, but I think a useful calibration. And that was a program that was actually really designed as a control condition in which participants just earned 10 times as much as usual for scheduled workouts. So instead of earning roughly 20 cents, they earned almost $2 every time they went to the gym. So if we give them a decent payment, that increases gym attendance by about 25%. Interestingly, paying them more by about a factor of 10 is no more effective than this sort of psychologically wise focus on not having a missed workout for more than 1 day in a row. So cool measuring stick, incentives work, good old fashioned incentives work, but we can build psychologically wise interventions that are as effective as them. And then the third one I'll highlight, which I think is neat, was designed by Bob Cialdini, who's a really great scientist. And I should say the last two I should attribute to John Bashirs of Harvard Business School, the lead scientist on those. This one was a Bob Cialdini idea around using social norms to increase interest in exercise. And there's some research suggesting that not only do we care about what everyone else is doing and want to follow that norm, but if we see an increasing trend, then we get even more excited. So for instance, telling you 80% of your peers are doing something makes you more interested in doing it. But if I tell you 80% are doing it up from 70% last year, that's even better. And that's what this treatment tested and proved was effective in this context, which was basically displaying some statistics to people, both at sign up and via text messages afterwards that said people are exercising more than ever before. This is true, it was not made up. There's a rising trend in the American population, and learning this increased gym visits by about 24%. Okay, one other interesting factoid from our study is that we tested whether people could predict what worked, because if just looking at all these designs, it's obvious to policymakers which ones are going to be the most useful, then we probably don't need to do all the work to run a mega study. We could just run a prediction tournament and be done. We could design the things but not launch them. So we wanted to see whether there would be predictive power, and we tested this with a few different populations that might be useful. One was just paid prolific workers, online survey respondents who looked at a bunch of different versions of the program and estimated how well they would work. We also had professors from top 50 schools of public health who study exercise make predictions about which would be the most effective. And we had some practitioners from top applied behavioral science companies. So think about organizations like Ideas 42 and Behavioral Insights team. These are basically nudge units. They made predictions. And I'll give you a summary of all three in one to save us time, which is to say that they couldn't predict what would work. So the correlation between the average predictions and actual data was 0. And the other really interesting thing is that they were very bad at predicting the magnitude of effect. So here I've plotted the original estimated treatment effects in blue that we saw earlier on the left, And on the right, you can see all the average estimated effects of our different raters. And the first thing that you should notice is that the orange is to the right of the blue, and that's because on this scale, people were expecting these treatments to have vastly larger effects than they did. So they're thinking, oh, we're going to get an extra 1 to 1.5 gym visits per week from these treatments. In reality, the best performer got an extra 0.3 gym visits per week. So wild over-optimism about effect sizes was a big takeaway, and absolutely no calibration in terms of what's best and worst. So that's really interesting, I thought, and suggest we do need to do this empirical work. Okay, so let me wrap up and say some key takeaways from this, and then I will much more briefly tell you about some vaccine work that was a lot simpler and is easier to go through quickly, and then we'll have time, hopefully about 15 minutes for questions. Okay, so 45% of our treatments worked at low marginal cost for 4 weeks, so that's exciting. They did not cause couch potatoes to become marathon runners. They led to 9 to 27% increases in gym visits that were lower than people expected. And we found people are really bad at predicting what will work in advance and are overly optimistic about effect size, suggesting that doing these kinds of mega studies can be really quite valuable for figuring out what is the best way to move forward and understanding and calibrating expectations for how beneficial these kinds of behavioral science treatments will be. I also didn't talk about enduring change, but I do want to highlight that that is much harder to achieve than temporary change. So these were 4-week programs, but we looked, hey, for a year afterwards, did they have durable effects? And most of them didn't. Most of them did not produce individually durable effects. Only 8% produced change that individually can be detected post-intervention. In aggregate, we can see that there's about a 30% carryover effect. If you induce an extra gym visit, say, per week, from a treatment, for a 4-week treatment, you get about 30% of that carrying over to the 10-week follow-up. So there's some habit formation happening, but it's small and hard to detect, and probably the best practice would be just to keep these treatments in place rather than to do a temporary treatment and hope it'll have durable results. Okay, so what came next? So this was our first foray into doing mega studies, and we felt like it taught us a lot. And then the question was, is there a relevant pressing policy problem where we could use this methodology to really be of help? And the answer came when COVID hit. It became quickly clear that the best thing that we could do with this sort of methodology would be to try to rapidly test new ways that might be useful for encouraging vaccination. And in fact, what we did is we got our team of scientists working on the problem before vaccines were even ready. So we'd have best practices available to suggest to government. But it's really important to look at real outcomes. So we tested ideas for encouraging flu vaccination in the fall of 2021 when COVID vaccines were close to ready. So we encouraged flu vaccination. Everybody knew the end goal, though, was to build something that would work to nudge COVID vaccination. So they developed messaging with that in mind. And I'll tell you about 2 mega studies we did. And for those who are skeptical that something tested on flu could then be used for COVID, let me just say that multiple studies have since been run, successfully showing our best performers did work and did increase COVID vaccination. So we have a really happy ending story. In fact, another paper replicating and extending this to COVID vaccinations came out yesterday. So that's really exciting. So I'm going to show you what we learned and can preview that it was helpful. Okay, 2 studies. The first was with 2 large health systems. And what we did is we said, let's try to nudge their patients 3 days before they're going to see a doctor for a healthy visit to accept a flu vaccine at that healthy visit when it's offered to them. So patients who had a visit to the doctor in the flu season of fall of 2021 got enrolled in the study. There were 50,000 people who ended up in the study, and they had gotten flu shots about half the time the prior year, which is roughly the US average, so pretty representative. And here we're randomly assigned to one of 20 experimental conditions, so a slightly smaller study than we did with 24-hour fitness. There were an average of 2,000 people per condition, 19 treatments and 1 control that was just business as usual. You get a reminder text to come to your doctor's appointment, but it doesn't mention a flu shot, and then you're offered a flu shot at the appointment. So we want to see, can we increase the number of people who accept the flu shot offered to them at their appointment or in the 3 days before it, after we've started messaging them, because we might change their decision to go walk into a pharmacy and get one. So condition determine the text messages people received in those 3 days prior to an appointment from their doctor's office. And 26 scientists designed these 19 treatments. They had all different hypotheses, again, to give you a sample of them. One team wanted to know if humor could be used to make vaccination more approachable and memorable. They texted people a joke and said, have you heard the one about the flu? Don't spread it around. Ha ha ha. Don't forget to get your vaccine at your upcoming appointment. So maybe that would make you laugh. You tell other people about it, you'd be more likely to remember and you want to do this. Another group thought, we often dedicate marathon runs to loved ones. What if we dedicate vaccinations? So invited people to dedicate their vaccine to a loved one. Another group thought using language that might be reminiscent of the endowment effect or defaults could be useful, and they tested whether telling people a vaccine has been reserved for you would make you more interested in getting it. Maybe now it feels like it belongs to you, you don't want someone else to get your vaccine, it's probably recommended. Would that work? Okay, tested all of these interventions. 32% of the messages outperformed the usual care control significantly. If we pool, we can say text messaging was effective on average. And the best performer, and actually all of the top 3 and none of the rest, used the language, a vaccine has been reserved for you. That leapt to the top as the obvious best performer. The joke was a total dud, though that was probably my favorite. So oops, I don't have great intuitions. That was not useful. This best performer, just so you can see, it used very standard language that you'd expect to get from your doctor, and says when you're going to be there, it's flu season, this vaccine is available for you, protect your family, it's reserved for you. And 2 messages, 72 hours before and 24 hours before the appointment, led to about a 10% increase in vaccination. So that reserved for you message is what we got really excited about. Also, we learned just from analyzing across all of the treatment conditions that if the message was interactive or sort of felt out of step with what you'd expect to get from a provider, it tended to do worse. We did one more mega study that's very similar with Walmart pharmacies across their 5,000 roughly locations in the US. It was even bigger. This involved text messages to everyone who'd gotten a flu shot there the prior year. It involved 700,000 people, really large population. We tested different things here. Text messages sent in September, encouraging people to drive into their pharmacy and ask for a flu shot. So it's a different behavior. And we have about 30,000 participants per condition. And we're testing whether that text sent in September leads to a flu shot by the end of the year. And they got text messages on September 25th and for up to 3 days after that. And the scientists in this designed all sorts of different treatments. Again, things ranging from describing vaccination as a way to protect family and friends, boost uptake. Is it helpful if we tell you there's a rising social norm? That may sound familiar. Asking you to think about all the places you could catch the flu. And interestingly, first of all, everything worked. We were really well powered. Every single treatment test was better than nothing. So the reminders were really effective. Sending multiple messages was better than one. So nagging worked. But the top, I believe 3 of the top 4 used the language, a flu shot is waiting for you, which was as close as we could get to reserve for you here. They didn't want to say that due to fear of stockouts, so we changed language to waiting for you, but it's very similar. 3 of the top 4 used that very same language. So basically the same winner here. And the best performer was really simple, just says, remember a flu shot's waiting for you, and the second message after the first telling you can get a flu shot at Walmart. So key findings, this sort of waiting for you, reserved for you language, super effective, multiple messages better than others. And excitingly, this led to work that was then published in Nature by an offshoot team of some of the co-authors on the first 2 projects, showing this helped increase COVID vaccinations, to use that ownership language. And again, another paper came out yesterday showing the same thing in a different population even later in the pandemic response. So that was really exciting. Okay, so let me wrap up a tiny bit later than hoped. Mega studies can accelerate scientific discovery. Hopefully I've proved that to you. Compare apples to apples, reduce risks and fixed costs of work, facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration. In the case of our work on flu shots, I think they led to exciting policy recommendations that were better than what we would have generated based on scientific intuition. And we did look at prediction in those contexts as well, I should say. It was a little better calibrated, but still couldn't pick out what would be the best performer well at all. But mega studies do have limitations, and maybe we'll talk about that a little in the Q&A. They're hard to implement. They're complex and costly. They require really large samples and centralized coordination. And another thing we didn't talk about, but that is important, is that the effects of top performing interventions are almost always overestimated because of the winner's curse. It's a distribution. And so you have to actually sort of ratchet down expectations even a little bit more. Those top performers are our best estimate of what should be rolled out, but they will be overestimated because any distribution, the outliers need to be adjusted. So that's an important thing to know. Okay, so let me stop and use our remaining time for Q&A, and thanks for your patience with my tech challenges. So I'm glad we got back online.
Thank you, Katie. This is very interesting. Certainly reminds me from my back days when I was doing epidemiology and clinical trials. I can see there's some question in the chat from, I don't know if, excuse me if I'm not pronouncing your name right, Zhao Chen. Would you like to pose your question directly to Katie?
Oh, hi. It's not a real question. I just happened to came across this article published a few days ago. The title is shocking, so I haven't read it carefully, but I'm just curious as to how Katie would comment on it, if you are also aware of that article.
Yeah, I saw that come out. I think I think it's easy actually to comment on this one, and I think it actually is more reason to be doing the kind of work that I've just been talking about, because basically the issue is that in general, when we write papers, there's a publication bias, and we don't quite know how to adjust for that when we look across an entire field. And so different researchers doing meta-analyses try different ways. There was a review article published on nudges at the beginning of the year saying they have a pretty big effect size on average, adjusting for everything you might want to adjust for. And some 3 new papers I think came out this week saying, oh, well, we would adjust for publication bias in different ways. And one of them, the one with the most exciting headline, said, the way we would adjust for publication bias, you'd say there's no results, that nudges are useless. Basically, there's huge researcher flexibility in deciding what's the right adjustment. But the beauty of a mega study is we are publishing everything. There's no publication bias, and you can see are nudges effective. For instance, in these 3 studies, I just showed you all of our results. On average, we find in each of those settings that nudges are effective. So that's pretty conclusive in my mind that that shocking headline is invalid, but it tells you something about how difficult it is to look across the literature, conduct a meta-analysis, and come to a solid conclusion. And mega studies can help because we put all our eggs on the table. You don't have to correct for publication bias. Everything's out there. There's another nice paper that was written and published in a top econ journal a couple of years ago by Liz Linos and Stefano Della Vigna that literally looked at every single nudge tested by the nudge unit in the behavioral insights team. So again, a full sample, and then looked at the effect size there. On average, they found nudges are effective, but the effects are probably smaller than people expect. So there's no doubt that we're overly optimistic about how big the results will be from these sorts of things. But when we look at unbiased collections like those in these mega studies and all behavioral insights team studies combined, we see they do have effect. So I think the sort of exciting headline, all it says is, gosh, when there's researcher degrees of freedom in doing a meta-analysis, you can get any result you want. but we know from these studies that don't have those degrees of freedom that thankfully nudges do add value.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Angie, would you like to pose your question directly to Katie?
Sure. Hi, Katie. Thank you for this. It's super fascinating. My question is about the logistics of running a study of this magnitude. So, I mean, these are sort of entry-level questions, but how do you pay for it? How do you coordinate that many collaborators on a project? How do you keep all of them aligned and meeting deadlines in order to sort of roll this thing out? It's certainly an undertaking not for the faint of heart.
Yes, I think you have hit the nail on the head that it is not for the faint of heart and is a massive undertaking. We have a research center that basically built up a specialty in doing and coordinating this kind of work with a team of PhD scientists and research assistants that have learned how to do it. And we actually, Angela and I just wrote an invited paper for PNAS Nexus that sort of talks through some of those frequently asked questions we're getting from other teams that are interested in launching similar efforts to try to help clarify, like, how would you do this? I mean, the truth is, it's just a big RCT. It's just a big field experiment. So there's not, the main art is like, yeah, how do you wrangle all these people? And we've tried to develop some streamlined processes that make it easier. Funding, just like you would for any big project where you have to go out and find funding from funding agencies to support this kind of work. We've been lucky to get a lot of different grants that allowed us to do the work we did, from organizations like Flu Lab, which supported our work, the NIH that supported our work. We had some seed funding from the University of Pennsylvania when we started to just establish that this was a valid methodology, and we're continuing to fundraise for our ongoing work. Sometimes we've found corporate partners that want to test something in their organization and they're willing to fund the work. So it depends on what's the outcome you're measuring. Is it of interest to this organization or that? But basically just grants are the way we support this, and staff. But it isn't, it isn't a team of 100, it's a team. We've been able to do mega studies with a team of 3 or 4 staff, including a couple PhD scientists and a couple folks just out of undergrad who are great research assistants. So it is feasible to do things on this scale. And I'd say the average funds needed for something like this are in the $1 million range. So, we're not talking about $1 billion or a team of 100. It is feasible for this to be done with the kind of team you could build in a year, say. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Anne? You're muted, Anne.
Okay, hi, Katie. Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I have just millions of questions. I'll throw out one that's probably not too fair to ask of you, but I would anyway, because it's really important to the business and management community. As you know, we do research in a business setting primarily, and nonprofits, mostly organizational context. And many of the important decisions that can help the world to be better are very complex. And let me just use one example, and I would love to see just your thoughts on it. One is for companies to pay the minimum wage. Well, I mean, they are paying the minimum. What I meant is to pay the living wage. That the goal $15 per hour, for example, and many countries in Europe are already doing that for many years. In US, we haven't. Lots of excuses. So to me, there's a potential study of how to nudge executives to think about the positive benefits of paying. And we know those benefits are socially constructed. They can construct any excuse you want to say it's not cost effective. In fact, I think we can make an argument that potentially it's more cost effective to pay living wage than otherwise. Do you have any thoughts? Or how would you tackle a problem like that using the powerful method that you have?
Yeah, I think the only limits of this method are our imagination, right? Any setting where there's a policy relevant question and you might think about running an experiment to test, say, different messages to executives, there's no reason you couldn't make it a mega study. The main constraint would be, do you have a large enough population to have statistical power to test multiple things at once, right? And you've noticed we worked with very large organizations and had very large sample sizes for a reason, because we, having 700,000 people to text at Walmart gave us the ability to differentiate, one treatment's performance from the next with some precision. If you do a mega study with 100 people in it and test 15 treatments, you're going to come away with a big mess of data you can't distinguish. But as long as there was a large enough sample of executives, there's no reason you couldn't design a mega study to ask, what's the most persuasive message I could offer them to encourage support for the minimum wage. So there's a team that recently did a mega study on misinformation, I believe, and trying to figure out what might stamp out the effects of misinformation, led by Dave Rand at MIT. We've done mega studies since the ones that I presented, looking at encouraging emergency savings with a large US bank, as well as trying to get more kids to persist on math problems on a large online math platform. We're rolling out studies to encourage students to stay in school who are enrolled in colleges and universities in the US. So there's a huge range of problems that this methodology can be applied to, and I've only shown you a sample.
Okay, that's very encouraging. Thank you.
And Katie, I love the idea of megastudies and RCTs. But I suppose one of the challenges for me has been historically is what I call kind of the evidence for evidence challenge, in the sense that, when we try to implement this RCT informed insights into practice, so, we often fail to actually make it work, not because the insights, there were issues with the insights, but actually bring into the real world practice. Do you have a view on, what's kind of developing the, if you like, evidence for implementing evidence in the real world?
Oh gosh, that's interesting. I mean, I have always felt that even if there isn't a study to point to on a specific question yet to show we can make a dent, you can point to successes in other settings, right? So even if I couldn't tell you, I know I'm going to be able to increase vaccinations with messaging, which actually there was some evidence that we just thought we could do even better than past research, probably, if we put our minds to it. But even if there weren't that evidence, I could say, well, vaccination, it's a one-time decision. There's obviously behavioral challenges, and we've seen that we can convince people to vote. So why shouldn't we be able to convince them to vaccinate? So I think I would basically use sort of analogical reasoning to point to successes in parallel settings and say that means that there's a real value in collecting evidence here too. That's normally, when I go into a new domain, the argument I try to make, that we have so much collective evidence from so many settings of the value of behavioral science, even if it's not been proven in this particular narrow context, I can point to some related context where it's been shown.